Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, if that's where you are in the world. It's great to welcome you to this particular session of Reviewer Meets Reviewed, which features Dr. Chloe Nahum-Claudel from the LSE and Olivier Allard from Paris. I should just clarify that Olivier has very kindly stepped in because the reviewer of the book couldn't be with us. And so he is a reviewer of the book, as it were, but not the reviewer of the book. But nevertheless, it's very, very good that he can be with us and join in our conversation. And we look forward very, very much to the event. So the organization, it will be as usual if you've been to one of these before. But just in case not, Chloe will talk about her book for up to half an hour, depending on how the spirit takes her. And then Olivier will begin our discussion. And then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. Please feel free, though, to send in your questions as they come to mind. You don't need to wait into the Q&A part of the box. And that will mean that we can think about them even beforehand when as the seminar is coming along. So I think that's quite enough from me. And we ask Chloe to say a bit about this beautiful book that she has written. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation, David, and thanks, Henning, for organising this so adeptly, and also Ted. I'm going to share my screen with you so that I can show you some pictures and also a bit of video. And now you've all disappeared, so I feel like I'm entirely on my own with nobody listening, but I know that that's not the case. So I'm just going to carry on regardless.
We can see your slides.
You can, it's all good.
Yeah, go good.
Yeah, so I also really want to thank Olivier, who is a great friend of mine and a colleague. So it was really great to be able to talk with him about the book, because I know he's read it recently, and that's also a rare privilege. If you write a book and friends of yours read it, it's a really wonderful thing. So let me just give you an overview. My book is an ethnography of a diplomatic ritual called Yanqua, and it's also a book about ritual innovation. I did my fieldwork with VNO and Inouye during a period of their history when they mobilized their ritual life to negotiate the development of hydropower dams. And so there's two parts to this talk. First, I'm going to give you the kind of bare bones of how I connect an analysis of ritual with ideas about diplomacy. And that's something I've talked about a lot and written about in various different publications. And the second half of my talk, I'm going to talk about work, the labor that goes into doing ceremonialism every day. And that sort of speaks to the second part of my title, the ritual every day. So we often think about rituals as being events that interrupt everyday life and make things more interesting, you know, a kind of break from the workaday, things like Christmas and other feasts. So what does it mean for the ritual to be an everyday routine? And that's a question that really interests me. First, though, hydropower dams. So this is a kind of ball map that I have made, which shows Enaoine territory in grey, and the village there, Halataikwa, is a dot. And it also shows the Nambikwara, Paresi, Hikpetsa, and Sintalaga indigenous territories around it. And it's with these people that the Enaoine in 2010 shared the 6 million reais in compensation for the, at the time, 11 hydroelectric dams, which are marked on the map as well. And this is an agribusiness and hydropower frontier. So these indigenous territories are increasingly surrounded by soya monoculture, cattle ranches, and, you know, big infrastructure projects are the thing in the Amazon. So about 30% of indigenous territories in the Amazon basin are now affected by hydroelectric dams, and most of these are funded by the Brazilian National Development Bank, and that's been over the last 20 years. And this, of course, reflects a global trend in which energy frontiers are moving into increasingly marginal lands occupied by indigenous people. So my research with the Enaoine Inouye in 2008 and 2009 was really emblematic of that wider global process. A series of small hydropower dams, each about 30 megawatts, was being constructed upstream of the Enaoine's fishing waters. But everyday life in the Anaoenes village in Mato Grosso state was animated by a routine of musical ceremonialism. So men played flutes from 3 to 8 in the morning and from 3 to 8 in the afternoon and evening, and that followed an archetypal sequence. At the same time, though, boats sped back and forth to the city at the time. City is an exaggeration. Really, this is a small Amazonian frontier town, but very rapidly growing. So the boats went back and forth for meetings with state agencies about hydropower compensation. And the day that I arrived in this frontier town of Brasnoche in 2008 to start my PhD fieldwork, and I'd already visited for a month in 2006 to get permission, and then I'd applied for government permission as well in the intervening time. But yeah, I arrived in 2008 and I met a group of Anaoene men who were in town at the offices of the kind of Bureau for Indigenous Affairs, and they were there to ask for help for the ritual. And this consisted of 10,000 litres of gasoline for their annual dam fishing expeditions. Now, at this point, the government was seeking the Anaoenes' consent for these heavily subsidised and government incentivised hydropower dams. And so, of course, they were happy to oblige with the 40,000 reais this would cost. And it also helps, of course, that the Anaoene were asking for help for the ritual, and that the Anaoene fit with the kinds of canons of authenticity that, in a way, are a way of gaining favour with the state. So, for example, with COVID now, the Anaoene were among the first in Brazil to be vaccinated. They were vaccinated in late February, but only Indigenous people in Brazil who live inside demarcated Indigenous territories have this privilege. And since there have been no Indigenous territories demarcated for the last 10 years in Brazil, and there are increasing populations of Indigenous people on the frontiers, on the edges of towns, obviously this excludes as many people as it privileges, probably more. So just to give a bit more historical context to that situation, the Anaoene were basically kept in a kind of isolation bubble by the Jesuit missionary who contacted them in the 1970s. So that meant that the community were almost monolingual at the time of my fieldwork. They'd only had motorboats to make visiting town easy over the last 10 years. And it was really then with the relationship with the hydropower dams, that a relationship with the state became established. And these are images of Vicente Canas, the Jesuit priest who lived with the Anaoene for a decade before he was assassinated by anti-Indigenous landowners in Mato Grosso. And as you can see, he's cut his hair in the Anaoene style. He's wearing their earrings, and this sort of represents the way that he followed an ethic of incarnation. So he would dance in their rituals, but he didn't try and missionize or catechize in any way. And this is very interesting, of course, because it contrasts with many colonial regimes and many missionaries who ban rituals as demonic, or who appropriate and transform rituals, for example, turning a feast into a communion. But whilst we can see this as not changing Anaoene life, which is, of course, how the missionary organization saw it themselves, of course, the affirmation of ritual life is also a kind of way of transforming it. And the missionaries joked that the Anaoene were the Benedictine order of the forest with this kind of routinized ritualism. So here's a picture of one of the 6 fishing dams that the Anaoene built in 2009, and whose construction I followed closely, living with 12 fishermen for 6 weeks, and that's chapter 1 of the book. And sort of one of the overarching questions of the book that links the ritual process and this hydropower diplomacy is the question, how does the fact that the Anaoene are dam builders themselves shape their response to the construction of these concrete dams upriver? And what happens when the concrete dams mean that their wooden dams fail and they have to buy frozen fish from an aqua farm instead? And then other questions like, how does political warfare against the hydropower infrastructure, so the Anaoene invaded and burnt the dam construction site while I was there in 2008, how does that square with the eventual acceptance of compensation after that? And my response to some of these questions is to reveal how new forms of political agency draw on the resources of ritual life oriented to diplomacy. In the intro, I discuss why it might be counterintuitive for people to link Amazonia and diplomacy. So Amazonian peoples are famously supposed to be stateless or anti-state and oriented to predation and warfare. And one of my goals in the book is to contrast that bellicose predatory model, which applies really well to some groups in the Amazon, like the Tupi-speaking neighbors of the Anaueninawe, the Sintalaga, who cannibalized the Anauene until the 1960s. But it doesn't apply so much to the Anauene and other fishing and agricultural people who have elaborate rituals, supralocal organization, and in the past, trading networks, and who also favor these kinds of predation like dam fishing that are a way of avoiding bloodshed. So I analyze ritual sequences to unfold the different dimensions of this diplomacy, and I draw ritual theory and Amazonian theories of kinship and alterity into a synthesis to propose the diplomatic potential of ritual in general. And let me take you to a famous Cold War situation to illustrate what I might mean by diplomacy. So it's November 1968 in Paris, and the parties to the Vietnam War spent 10 weeks determining what shaped table they would need to begin talks, and eventually they fixed on a circle. And within the bounded frame of a meeting room and in an interactional space structured by a table and by norms governing the order of speech, its duration and turn-taking, these talks became possible. And I suggest really that something similar happens in the Anauene's circular arena every day. And this arena is a kind of public forum and a kind of stage in which performance and politics are played out. Oops. So until 2 months ago, when the Anauene founded a second village to become a multi-settlement polity for the first time in at least 150 years, the whole population lived in a single village. The houses are laid out panoptically, as you can see here, around the open plaza in the middle. So these people, the population was 600 in 2009, but is now closer to 2,000. They've lived their whole lives together and they're meshed together through alliance. But in the arena, you wouldn't know it. So there's a kind of formality and estrangement and self-reflexivity that give relationships a diplomatic character. In this arena, speech is very measured and stylized, and movement is choreographed as people signal their interpersonal alignments using different gestural and postural codes. For example, when the hosts serve drinks to the flute players, they avoid direct gaze, they stand side on and utter conventional speeches. It's as if the primary agents of the act of giving and receiving are somewhere beyond or between the co-present men. So they're standing in the middle of a cosmically aligned space, and it's as if they're pure representatives of larger social collectives and cosmological positions, not brothers-in-law or father and grandfather to the same kids. So basically the arena is made for the mediation of otherness, and it's a space for civility among persons who relate as social others. At the same time, they're relating as opposing cosmological positions. So for example, the living and the dead, and I'll show you an example of that soon. So in this cosmically aligned space, people's movements are taken to participate and coerce cosmic patterns. And I'm interested in the ways that in diplomatic situations of all kinds, gigantic entities are replicated in small places and by small things, and banal resources of interaction, things like tables and chairs or drinks, become important for the destiny of peoples. It's as if every encounter is a leap in scale. And that, I think, invites self-reflexivity and strenuous efforts on the micro scale to summon and shape the world. So by describing those kinds of ceremonial actions in the village centre and negotiations that take place at highly codified meetings with state representatives or at armed roadblocks, which have become a staple in the Anauene's relations with the Brazilian state, I show that the surprising ways the Anauene were able to challenge state sovereignty over natural resources and public wealth can be explained with reference to these diplomatic ritual practices in the village. Things like public dialogues, performances and exchanges, a sort of a training ground for the negotiation of sovereignty, even in these situations of great power asymmetry. And so my larger argument is that the NONE were trying to impose a diplomatic relation of rival sovereignty in their engagement with the state. And for me, diplomacy is a way to theorize the political dimension of ritual, the ways that it's a source of political and social innovation in response to historical ruptures. And so that's the way that I connect my research on these calendrical ceremonies and everyday ritual activity with stuff on state interaction and resource politics. It's often the case that the lens of ritual can be depoliticizing, and I'm interested in how it can help us to conceptualize Indigenous sovereignty and diplomacy and how that can endure through processes of colonial dispossession. Of course, colonialism is founded on a negation of diplomacy. The land is defined as lacking in sovereigns. The definition of terra nullius is exactly that. Treaties might be signed with Indigenous people, but then ignored. But to pursue a diplomatic solution, which is what I argue the NONE did through the hydropower crisis, is to refuse submission and at the same time to reject a solution founded on warfare. At the same time, though, warfare and diplomacy can't be simply opposed. I show that they're in an internal relation or tension. So the NONE's strategy, which proved very effective, was to move between moments of confrontation and moments of negotiation. For instance, they first invaded and burned the hydropower infrastructure, and then they sought out high-level meetings in Brasilia with the ministries responsible. And one of the things I show in my book is that that dynamic is kind of has the temporality of the seasonal ritual calendar. So this is a picture of Ketioko, which is when women dance and men serve them drinks. So it's kind of an inversion of the relationship that happens during Yankwa. And it was during Ketioko that men, who are much freer because they don't have to sing and dance in the arena every day, invaded and burnt the hydropower infrastructure. Okay, so I've basically taken up exactly 15 minutes, which is great. And I'm shifting now to another major question in the book, which might seem a bit disconnected from what I've been talking about now. And this is a source of kind of real intrigue to me, and it accounts for a lot of the descriptive and interpretive effort for the book. And I find this question is well expressed by this sign, which is designed to trouble commuters on the M40. And I think when I was a kid in the 90s and I first read this sign, it said, "Why do I do this every day?" And now it says, "Why do I still do this every day?" So of course, a good chunk of Western philosophy is about this question, you know, what makes life worth living? What's a worthwhile existential project, etc. Now, in my book, these questions are focused on this apparent paradox in my book's title. And I'm just going to let that go on without the sound so it doesn't distract from what I'm saying. It's quite a poor quality video. It's one of the many ones that sent to me on WhatsApp recently by friends in the village. So during Yankwa, a ritual season that lasts for 8 months of the year, men dance like this, broadly speaking, from 3 to 7 a.m. and from 3 to 7 p.m. And there are various formations to the dancing, and there are many variations on that daily routine. And there's also a kind of momentum of intensification as each phase of the ritual progresses. So the intensity and duration of the orchestra increases as more people join in and as they play for longer into the day. It's as if a lot of what people are doing is rehearsing. They're perfecting the music and the chants that alternate with it. But there's also not any neat division between rehearsal and performance. All rehearsals are also performances, but there's this momentum of intensification and perfectification as the phase of the ritual progresses. And you can see here that there's some quite small boys on the end of the line, which means that we're further along in the ritual sequence. So this is the kind of paradox I unpack of what it means to do ritual every day and what that does to our definitions of ritual and of labor processes. I'm going to read you the first paragraph of chapter 3, where I deal most explicitly with the labor involved in ritual, its character, its temporality, and most of all, what I'm interested in, which is what motivates it and how it in turn kind of drives life onward. Grabbing his headdress and palm fiber silks from their hanging place by the front door, Yokwaliene, here on the left, turned to me with a smile and said, "I am the ritual, I am off to work." He was on his way out to the flute house, and here you can see the interior of the flute house, where he would dress for the afternoon's flute playing session. His joke self-consciously incorporated the Portuguese words work and ritual into an Enawe syntax. From spending time in the town of Juína, Yokwaliene had plenty of experience of administrative staff and shopkeepers having set hours and distinct spaces demarcated for work. His parting comment indicated the similarly routinized nature of Yankwa's musical ceremonialism. As he bathed, dressed in palm silks and painted with a natto dye ready to begin his daily ceremonial routine, Yokwaliene did look much like an office worker getting suited and booted for work. In 2009, he bought a digital alarm clock as a practical accessory to this routine. He set it to wake him at 3 a.m. every night, since he was among Yankwa's leadership that year, and he wanted to ensure he was among the first in the flute house. I loathed to hear the robotic voice in the dead of night repeating, "It's time to get up. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. It's time to get up. It's 3 o'clock in the morning," until he switched it off, which usually took him a while. It awoke a nagging feeling in me that a better anthropologist would leave their sleeping bag and go outside to transcribe men's chants with a willing informant. I was more comfortable in a female role, allowing the music to wash over me in sleep before getting up to help serve manioc porridge at around 4 a.m., which is when dancers pause to drink and chat. It wasn't only Yokwaliene who thought of dancing as work, to be punctually attended and stoically pursued. Men often complained that their limbs ached from dancing during the seasons of Yankwa and Leruhi, and women grumbled about their aches and pains when they danced alongside men during Leruhi and without them at Katioko. I experienced this myself when I danced with Leruhi every day for 3 weeks. It freed me from harvesting and processing manioc, but was much more exhausting than stooping to dig up heavy tubers in the dirt or carrying a 40-kilo basket of manioc. My legs, back and head ached from the small controlled steps I had to make in time with the rest of the line of dancers, while the hot sun beat down on my head and the itchy feather ornaments clung to my chest. But when Enawe people complained of fatigue, they generally followed up with a comment, "It's tough, but that's the way Yankwa is. That is the way we Enawe are." In short, industriousness, sleeplessness, and eagerness, both to sing and dance and to tackle all the essential labours that go on around the arena, are values in and of themselves. So what I argue in the book is that this kind of Protestant ethic of industriousness, which goes with the Enawe's fairly puritanical diet that excludes meat and fermented drinks and tobacco, for example, is an energetic labour that itself is a social and subjective stimulant. I felt this in my fieldwork on the odd days when there was no ritual, and my companions would joke that it was like the Brazilian Sunday. It always felt that there was a lassitude or a deadness to the village, whose whole architecture is designed like a theatre in the round to host performances and collective feasts. What's more, because the Enawe take most of their meals from the mass catering of women allied to whichever is at that moment the host clan, on Sundays everyone was always hungry as well as bored. And here you can see a kind of typical meal happening in the centre. So we're used to thinking of economic activities like harvesting, cooking, gathering firewood, and laying ritual fires going on in the background to sustain and enable ritual activities like singing and dancing, exchanging surplus and feasting, or also as being a kind of accelerating and intensifying labour in the run-up to important events. Now, the Enawe's routine ritualism puts that division between economy and art or necessity and luxury into question. And that's because on the one hand, processing manioc is rhythmic and musical, and on the other hand, playing flutes at predictable times of the day and night is laborious and exhausting. So I ask in this chapter of my book how music can be understood as work, and how work as music, performance, or entertainment. And this picture shows a moment in Lerohi where men take their firewood chopping, which would normally happen like out the back of the houses, outside of the centre, into the centre, and they do it bigger and better, and they're doing it for the partners who they dance alongside. So there's this emphasis in all of the Enawene rituals on moments of magnification and publicization of everyday subsistence work. And because only men dance and play flutes at Yankwa, whereas only women harvest, process, and cook manioc or cassava, which you can see being grated here, this obviously has implications for the way that we can think about gender relations. And for me, the way that I want to think about them as egalitarian and highly performative and experimental. So people are always switching roles, and that reversal and turn taking, rather than being individualistic as it is in my house where, you know, we take turns to cook dinner and put the kids to bed and so on, is institutionalized in ritual temporality. And that happens at the scale of seasons. So you've got the two rituals of the dry season, Ketioko and Saloma, the women and the men's ritual, where sort of men and women swap roles in those different seasons. And you've got Lerohi and Yankwa that are similarly paired. But this also happens within each season. And I don't think this is my sort of feminist gloss being read through the Enawene Nawe, although I do take issue in the book with the ways that some ethnographers, who have generally been men, have assumed that if women are cooking and men are playing flutes and singing myths, then men are doing the grandiose existential work of singing the cosmos into being, while women are confined to the house and domestic drudgery. So one of my main analytical methodologies in the book is to analyze sequences of activity at various scales over months, days, or hours. And that might be routines that are repeated daily, like the grating of manioc, or it might be longer processes. So this is a sort of climactic event of so again, I'm going to silence that. So this is a kind of ritual within a ritual in Yankwa's 8-month process. And I devote chapter 2 entirely to kind of describing what happens in this 24-hour period when the fishermen return from the dams and make a kind of anticipated invasion into the village to be tamed and humanized by women and the ritual hosts. And this event fits really well with the kind of eventful notion of ritual, because it is this moment of climax. One of the things I show, though, is that the climax is actually just the start, not the culmination of the ritual process. So these fishermen, who are all decked in these green and black decorations, and they're called Yankwa, they return in body and spirit. But then for a further 2 months, they sing and dance in a daily routine during a season that's called Yankwa Returning. And they do that repeatedly. So there are 9 Enawene Nawe clans, and the men of 7 of those clans go fishing, while 2 host clans stay behind. But when Yankwa returns, each host clan is treated individually. So the men of 8 clans return for the first host over about 3 weeks, and then they start all over again. And the former hosts join in with Yankwa, and all 8 clans dance for 3 weeks for the remaining host clan, following the same archetypal sequence of song days all over again. And some years, while I was there, this happened both years, 1 or 2 extra host clans kind of pop up in response to illnesses in their clan. And the whole process is repeated again, then in a total of 3 or 4 times. So each of these sequences takes about 3 weeks. But within them, there are breaks in the routine that play on the boundary between these gendered activities and between what's functional and pleasurable. And the question for me that this seems to pose is, you know, how can music be understood as work? And I suggest that the Enawene are asking this as well through these ritual temporalities. So there's a 24-hour period in which men stay in bed, their flutes are silent, and women's manioc routine becomes explicitly a musical and visual performance. And I suggest that these interruptions of routine are a way of reflecting on the everyday round of routine ritualism and elevating it from its mundane status to reveal its poetic qualities. So this is one of the things that stops this kind of routine, which even with its pleasures is relentless, from becoming arduous. It's the fact that it's broken up with these feats of productivity, these festivals of work, as I call them, in which men and women's activities become suffused with desire and energetic enthusiasm to an exceptional degree. And that draws attention to the assimilation of sex and work as alternative means of expending energy while vitalizing the body. And the cover photo of my book is an example of one of these festivals of work. And what's happening here is that the men of 8 clans have been clearing a new collective garden for next year's host clan. And once it's burned and mostly cleared, they invite the women of the village to inspect it, since it's these women who are the ones who will harvest it in the following year. And so this is the women returning after their inspection, but I'm going to take you through the sort of backstory of this photo. So first, women go to the field, which looks like the swin, which looks like this, and they pile up and light fires with the remains of wood to make a nice tidy garden. And while they're doing that, the hosts, who are the owners of the garden, but not the ones who cleared it, come, and they're all kind of rubbed with annatto, and they've got silly, clownish kind of things attached to them, like children's toys. And they serve drinks to the women. And then the women return by the stream to bathe, and they've dropped their clothes and soap and annatto dye there on the way out, so that they can, get dressed before re-entering the village. And this, again, it's an expanded version of what happens every day. Women go to the gardens, they get dirty and sweaty, and then they bathe and paint and dress and start their work. But today, every woman in the village is doing it together, and there's a festival atmosphere. So this moment that I have on the cover is women re-entering the village, beautified. And again, they're re-entering the village via the centre instead of using the back doors as they usually would. And again, they're publicly served drinks by the men. So we can see this as a public recognition of women's labour and women's ownership of manioc gardens. It's also one of those events in which the daily round is collectivised, dramatised and energised to make it something extraordinary. So there's a bit about work, and I'm just going to end by saying that I've introduced my book by focusing on kind of 2 puns that are implicit in the title. One is the damned river, of course, and the question of how the NON's ritualized diplomacy is mobilized to engage in this necessary and urgent diplomacy with the state. And again, that's another kind of pun in the title, the idea of vital diplomacy, that diplomacy is vital and that it's necessary. But then I've also introduced the other meaning of that word vital, which is about activity that's life creating in an animist universe in which, people are very concerned with the sliding scale between life and death, and in which laziness and inactivity err towards death. There are lots of other questions in my book as well, for example, about the NON's history and how they came to be organized in this single village polity in response to a violent history of colonialism involving rubber and gold and slave raids here as elsewhere in the Americas. And about cooking and recipe choices and the sort of circulation of preserved foods as wealth, and how those processes mediate the relationship between people, demonic spirits, and ancestors. And of course, another major theme in the book is this dam fishing. The big question is, why is this 8-month ritual Yanqua? Why does it hinge on these all-male dam fishing expeditions in which men lie down to rest, as they say, like teenage girls during their first menstrual seclusion? So there are a few teasers for you. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and hand over to Ollie.
Well, shall I start? Well,
go ahead, please. Go ahead. The floor is yours. Thank you very much for that wonderful exposition. But yes, now it's your turn.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to discuss Chloe's work, which has always looked fascinating to me. I also work on lowland South America, and we've had the same supervisor as PhD students, and we broadly belong to the same tradition. But talking to Chloe and reading her work, I've always had the impression of something entirely different from what I knew. To give you just a few examples, the people I've lived with, who are called the Warao and are mostly in Venezuela, are divided in a great number of small settlements. Shamanism is strong, but there are hardly any collective rituals. People don't produce more than necessary because they enjoy being lazy and spending time with each other. And in their interactions with the state, they act as poor suffering people and as citizens who vote, but never as a sovereign collectivity that possesses a remarkable culture. So as you can see, the Nawe are really at another end of the spectrum. And I think it's really important to reflect on the common experiences shared by indigenous people in lowland South America to discuss the common challenges they face, and also to address their diversity. So my first comment is about the intense ritual activity that the Enawene engage in. The fact that every day is a collective work party, in a word, a ritual every day. So it certainly was a very exhausting fieldwork compared to mine. But I want to stress further something that Chloe has already said at the beginning, but which is very important in order not to misunderstand her work. The ritual is not opposed to or contradictory with the political. The ritual is political, and it is so in several different ways. First, getting resources to feed ritual activity is a key motivation for the relation with state and other institutions. They need to get boats and fuel and frozen fish in order to perform Yankwa. Second, rituals are also political tools. Indeed, the Enawene have enjoyed some degree of success with their claims because their ceremonial life appears as distinctive and valuable to Brazilian and Western eyes. But there is another side to it. Some rituals are also the means of adopting a more confrontational stance with outsiders, and confrontation is a necessary moment in their diplomacy. This directly leads me to a further comment. Ritual, and especially when we say that a practice is ritualistic, sometimes means that something is done without any mental or affective commitment. But this is definitely not so among the Enawene. In fact, ritual acts are prescribed, conventional, but they also shape experience and affect. For instance, when fishermen return from their expeditions to the fishing dams, they have really become strange to hosts and women back in the village. That's not just a role they play, but rather how they are perceived. They are unpredictable. Hosts are eager to meet them, but fishermen are reluctant to do so because they feel ashamed, or they are said to be ashamed. There needs to be a progressive reunion and familiarization. So overall, I think that this is so because there is a strong focus on the senses in Enawene ritual activity, and therefore in Chloe's ethnography. It's not so much about symbols and rules. It's all about colors and movements, sounds and smells, touch and taste. And I think this is in line with both Amazonian and general anthropological traditions. A certain affective and perceptive experience is produced through ritual, and because this is essentially a bodily activity. So my question now is, I wonder if you could say a bit more about the relation between the strategic and orchestrated dimension of ritual and its embodied nature. And more concretely, do you think it is possible to grasp this without a personal involvement in ritual?
Thanks, Ollie. I guess what you're asking me to do is sort of connect a bit more explicitly the two halves of what I talked about today. You're really right what you say about the progressive reunion and familiarization. So when men return from the fishing dams, people focus a lot on the fact that their fringes have grown really long and cover their eyes so that they can't see properly. And the men who return say that their wives' speech has become strange to them, and women speak so fast and we can't understand them. They've also been away from the manioc gardens for a really long time. So the staple food that they drink every day, which is this viscous, sweet, fragrant manioc porridge, they haven't had any for 6 weeks. So there's a kind of way in which the familiar has become strange to them while they've been away. And then, of course, they've left most of their girl children, some of their younger boy children behind, and their wives. And so this is also a family reunion. And the men are eagerly awaited as well, because one of the main things that men are doing at the dam is basket work and beadwork. And so they're coming home with loads and loads of gifts, which are the things that women really, really value. So all that family reunion stuff is happening, but at the same time, this is really an operatic ritual event. This is about the triumph of life over death. You know, there are these symbols. Men are coming up from the river at dawn and they're following the path of the sun overhead. And that's because the village is set up with this cardinally aligned path that runs from east to west in a very straight line. And then they're tamed with cooked drinks, and the hosts light a massive fire around which they dance, coming closer and closer into the center of the village. So there's some really kind of easily understood universal symbols. And one of the things I've argued is that anyone can watch this ritual, any outsider, and kind of understand what it's about. And that's one of the reasons that the NONA have been so appealing to filmmakers who always want to come and film this part of the ritual, this climax. But what Ollie's saying, of course, is that I'm interested in the ways that that symbolic stuff is happening with the experiential stuff and the economic stuff, you know, about the goods that are being exchanged and all the labor that's involved. So the atmosphere before the fishermen return is very interesting. It's an atmosphere of anxious anticipation. You know, it's febrile. So nowadays, there was a phone in the village already when I was there, and now everyone has smartphones, right? But even when the fishermen had rung up and said, we're coming in 2 days' time, we'll arrive in 2 days' time, people are so anxious that they prepare extra in advance. So women kind of increase their production of manioc porridge, and I calculated that they'd made about 4,000 litres of it for the fishermen's return. But they often make it a day early because they're so worried that like the men are going to trick them and come early, because some rumour goes around that that's going to happen. And then the whole lot rots and has to be made again the next day. But in a way, doing all that work is a way of coping with the sort of anxious anticipation. Okay, so to link that now with the politics and the kind of state politics. So the bit I talked about was mostly about the kind of communicative and behavioral aspects of ritual as a training ground for that interaction with the state. But there's also a more effective or energetic dimension to that. So the sort of energetic, relentless ritual work is something that also feeds into their sort of relentlessness when NONA representatives go to town to pressure state representatives to cede to their requests. And I wrote a bit about this in the very first article I published in 2012. If you're a FUNAI agent in an office in Juina, you've got a boring, fairly like ordinary desk job, but you've got NONA men camped outside your office all day, sitting there in the lobby until you give them those 40,000 reais they need for their 10,000 litres of gasoline to start their ritual. As soon as they get it, they're out of here, they're off. So what this does is this puts people to work for them. They sort of create that same energy in the people that they kind of enroll in their ritual creation. And the other thing that I think is important is that one of the ways that the state often tries to deal with Indigenous people is by individualizing them. So choosing, in Brazil, it would be called the cacique or liderança, choosing a person with whom to negotiate as a representative for the whole. Much easier, much less intimidating to negotiate with one NAWNE man than to negotiate with 50 NAWNE men who are there en masse. But basically, one of the things I think that they take from their ritual life into their political life, and I don't like the distinction, of course, but I have to use it, is that collectivity. They basically refuse this process of representation and individualization. So, for example, when it was them that demanded meetings in Brasilia after they burnt the hydropower dam, and they also demanded that 2 buses be hired to transport them, which is like 2 days drive, to Brasilia. So there were 85 people who went, and it's that kind of display of collectivity and a collective force that is such a strength to them in their politics as well. I think that's all I'm going to say on that question. Do you have any more?
Yeah, I have a couple more, and so your answer makes a perfect transition to my second question or comment, which is a bit more sociological, or at least concerns sociological imagination. Over the past few decades, Amazonian anthropology has focused on people who mostly live in small, undifferentiated settlements, who have what used to be called a very flexible social organization. And such flexibility has certainly helped them survive colonization, and it has also been analyzed as a consequence of being turned towards the outside. The settlements have no center because alterity is what really matters. The NAWNE, on the other hand, live in secular villages, or more precisely, until recently they lived in one single secular village. And as you've stressed, Chloe, there are strong institutions that foster interdependence within the village. There are constant cycles of exchange, and people very often do things on behalf of others. The NAWNE therefore form an egalitarian polity in the strong sense of the expression. However, what I want to stress is that even within this unitary village, Chloe's description shows that there is an element of imbalance. Yankwa is said to be the whole community, for instance, when the NAWNE speak in Portuguese. But actually, Yankwa is made up of all the clans, minus 1 or 2 clans that act as hosts. There is therefore this surprising arithmetic at play here. To think, to perform, to represent a whole, you need to subtract an element from it, so as to have some sort of internal dialectical process. So you'll have to read the book if you want to get all the details. And I jump to my conclusion. Even if the secular village of the NAWNE makes them look very different from what is found in many other parts of lowland South America, they share with other Amazonians a refusal of any straightforward concept of identity. One is never simply oneself. And with that comes a question. You've mentioned a split that recently happened and gave birth to 2 villages. And I know that you're eager to study this in the field, but with the knowledge that you already have, do you think that the NAWNE will act as 2 distinct political entities? And will the split complicate their claims to sovereignty?
Yeah. Yeah, this is so interesting to me right now. I'm just going to go in a bit to this thing that Ollie said, which is one is never simply oneself, and the kind of arithmetic of community, which is, I guess, the thing that was hardest for me to analyze as an ethnographer, and it's a big fat chapter in the book, which I didn't touch on in my presentation. And I'm just going to try and illuminate that in a really simple way. So that morning and nightly singing that I talked about, generally there would be 4 fires lit within, in front of the flute house. And at each fire, a different instrument, all aerophones, but a trumpet or a flute. would be being played. And each instrument would be played by a line of men in birth order. And they would dance in that birth order around the fire. And so when I first arrived and I saw, okay, I knew there were 9 clans. There was 1 host clan. There were 4 fires. I thought, okay, Yankwa is dancing for Auresice clan. There are 8 clans in Yankwa. There are 4 fires. So it must be 2 clans per fire. What's more, they look like clans because there's a run from senior to junior. And that's the way people always describe, you know, patrilineal clans is as a line of men going from senior to junior. Okay, but what I learned was that wasn't at all the case. Firstly, people never represent their own clan. And the other thing is that when people are part of Yankwa, their own clan affiliation becomes irrelevant. So your clan is only relevant when you're hosting. And that has huge implications for hierarchy. So sorry, let me just sort of complement that. So at each fire, there would be the mixed members of all the 8 clans. And the whole point is they're mixed. And if you're a man, you might play the gourd trumpet for one clan, Yankwa, and you might play the bamboo flute for another clan's Yankwa. You kind of mix it up depending on whose ritual it is. And so at the time of my fieldwork, the smallest clan had only 2 male adult members, and the biggest clan had 26. So a massive difference. But because each performance of Yankwa is done by everyone else except the host clan, every performance was basically more or less the same in scale because it was the mixed members of everyone else who danced. So what this means is that hosting rituals isn't about aggrandizing your clan. Every performance of Yankwa is about regenerating and recreating the whole community as mixture. And so this happens at sort of, I've given the example of dancing, but it happens with everything. So NIN people don't build their own houses. Everyone else builds your house for you. You never play your own flutes. Everybody else plays your flutes. Your clan owns a set of feather headdresses, but you never wear them. When you host, you put them on others. You have manioc gardens, but you never drink your own manioc. You serve it to others. You have your own spirits, but you don't celebrate them. Others do, etc., etc., etc. And this is what I call the principle of surrogacy, and that's the foundation for this social diplomacy that I evoked. Now, obviously, this is super interesting in the context of a village split, and this has been a system that's been working within an endogamous single village for a long time now, even though it's probably the case that in the past this was part of a kind of inter-village, multi-local visiting ritual. Now, there was a village split 10 years ago between my fieldwork in 2009 and my next fieldwork in 2010. And at that point, it was a witchcraft accusation that in a complex way arose from the tensions around the distribution of compensation for hydropower dams. So 2 important elders died, and it so happened that they were the ritual host and leader for each other's Yankwa. And with their deaths, there was a split of the village. And when that new village was created, and it turned out to be temporary, it was conceived at the time as being completely separate, a kind of, as you say, having its own sovereignty. And in fact, part of what it was doing was setting itself up near the road and nearer the Funai office so that it could grasp more of the resources for itself. So the village reunited that time, but 10 years later, it has now split again. And I guess what I'm really interested in is how this split, whether it's imbricated with kind of new patterns of conflict and a break in the diplomatic social contract, or whether it's a kind of innovation that is diplomatic in itself. And the reason it's not simple to split the village in a kind of easy, happy way is because you have auxiliary local residents, so women stay in the house they grew up. They don't leave when they marry. It's boys who marry into female houses, essentially. But those boys are members of patrilineal clans. So that means that if you have a village split, You can't have it both ways. Men can't both live with their wives' parents and be united with their clansmen. The split has to be at the expense of either women living with their parents and sisters, or at the expense of patrilineal clans being united. So what I learned last week from my sister's daughter, Koroshihi, was that it's actually been the latter option, which I consider to be the diplomatic option. So my extended family, who are part of Kairoli clan, the largest of the 9 clans, has stayed in the old village Halataikwa, but the other half of Kairoli has gone to the new village, and basically each of the large clans has split in half across villages. So different sort of lineages within the clan have remained or gone. But obviously there are so many questions that remain about how that is going to play out in terms of both ritual organization and marriage alliance politics, which are really entwined with each other. And how consensual that process has been really remains to be seen, and the implications for the distribution of resources from the state, and so on and so on.
Well, thanks a lot. I've got a third question, which is going to be shorter, so as to have time for the questions of the audience. And it's going to be about gender. Women work a lot, as we've seen, and they do so with their female relatives, but for their husbands' clans. So in a way, it could be said that work is done in female houses for male clans. And it seems to me that there's a kind of ambivalence or hesitation between two arguments which are not necessarily incompatible. So on the one hand, Chloe, you showed that outsiders, such as anthropologists, might minimize women's activity because of their own prejudices. What you show is that manioc work is ritual. Food production has cosmopolitical implications. It's not just women toiling to feed people while men are doing culture and politics. But on the other hand, gender relations are hardly ever neutral. Even so, in the case of the Enawene, even though there is a marked sexual division of labor, from a moral point of view, men and women seem to be equal, and violence between them seem to be rare. But this is a complex matter, and Amazonia is very diverse on this respect, and gender relations are also evolving in contrasted way. So I know that you've strengthened your feminist stance and recently co-organized a conference on the topic. And so I'd like to know how you see things now.
Yeah, Ollie's referring to a conference that happened Monday to yesterday this week with some Brazilian colleagues on feminist approaches in the indigenous Amazon, and so that came out of my kind of concern with the ways that in Amazonianist literature, things like polygamy, infant marriage, collective rape sanctions, the equation of women with prey animals, were kind of just like sprinkled into the ethnography as if they were unproblematic. And this kind of more gender power analysis, which is so, often central in so many regional traditions, has been somewhat less prominent, and that's been because of this imaginary of Amazonia as this egalitarian place. So I wanted to kind of look a bit more carefully about that. So one of the implications of my analysis of labour processes in the second part of my talk is that Uxori local residents, women living basically with their sisters and mothers and daughters, is really crucial. It's a feminist arrangement, basically. In 2008-9, there were only 2 women who lived with their husband's parents rather than with their own parents. And one of them was a good friend of mine. I often visited her, and her life was much harder. She would be working manioc on her own with her children, at her ankles, wanting attention and food, and she'd be tearing her hair out, like me at home. She wasn't surrounded by, she wasn't able to do that work collectively, which is what makes the work joyful and energizing, right? So that's something I was very concerned about, thinking about how this division would happen. Would it be an opportunity to shift to patrilocal residence, given that there are other shifts happening now with with like formal education being introduced, and that formal education privileging boys, and so boys learning Portuguese and having access to salaried work, and girls losing out. And so a kind of you know, macho culture sort of being imported through the ways that the state implements certain policies. Now, at this conference yesterday, I learned that this is exactly what has been happening in lots of places in the Amazon. So a colleague called Emilienne Island works with the Wauja in the Upper Xingu, and that's a very similar kind of circular village with elaborate rituals and so on. And she's worked there for 40 years. So she's comparing women's lot kind of 40 years ago with what happens now. And it's precisely, there has been a shift to patrilocal residence, which has come with boys getting education and access to salaries, and then buying commodities in town, and therefore also no longer having the dependence on their wives' labor. So, you know, what happens all over Amazonia is, you know, men need women's labor as much as women need men's labor. So if your husband displeases you, you don't give him any manioc drinks or any manioc bread. He quite soon decides to cease displeasing you. But if men have, you know, rice and beans to eat, they might not be so bothered about their wife's displeasure. So Emilienne sort of gave this sort of, to me, really bleak picture. She entitled it The Domestication of Wauja Women, and it was about all the ways that women's sexual freedoms are being curtailed, their political influence, lots of these kinds of consequences of sometimes very banal seeming interventions. So one of the things she talked about was water taps being put in behind the house, which you would think, oh great, water taps. Women no longer have to go down to the river and carry 40 litres of water up the hill afterwards. But what she's showing is that actually when women go down to the river, they call on their friends on the way, they gossip on the way, they share stories, they basically kind of promote their own political agenda through these backstage activities, whereas men are in the center of this panoptic village, and they're actually much more surveyed and in a way much more constrained in the ways that they can do politics than women are. So yeah, water taps, not so great. State education, again, not so great for egalitarian gender relations. So I learned a lot at this conference about, you know, possible futures for the NONIP, but there were also, you know, other kinds of arguments about more hopeful kinds of evolutions. So the ways that collective ritualism has fed into kind of female and feminist collective projects among, say, the Shikrin Kayapo, who have been, you know, developing their own kind of agricultural schemes and selling their own commodities and controlling that income and doing things with it that they want to do. And there are also some really interesting things happening in Ecuador with women being the ones at the forefront of negotiations with oil companies. And so, yeah, it's basically a mixed picture. And this is one of my kind of main research foci in the coming years, is to sort of, you know, think about this more in the NONIP context. And that's all I want to say. I'd be happy to take any more questions now.
Well, Olivia, Chloe, thank you so much for such a fascinating and rich picture. This is now the time when we go to questions from the floor. I can see that some are coming in already, so please just fire in your questions, and we'll get through as many as we can. I'm sure with such rich material there'll be lots of questions. Well, why don't we begin with the first one here? So Sarah Adnan says, my question is about your process in the field. Are these rituals only performed by men? And if so, how did you manage to be accepted in these circles?
No, I'm not muted. That's great. Hopefully, you asked that question at 4:25. Hopefully, you have kind of got a sense now that what women are doing is just as much ritual as what men are doing. one of the privileges of being an outsider is that you're, I mean, I don't think it's just being outsider. I think I also explored the ways that NO and gender identities are very much experimental and fluid. And there are ways in which, in lots of activities, men become feminized, and in other activities, kind of women become masculinized. And there's a play on what it means to be masculine or feminine in lots of different contexts. So my fieldwork was very much sort of working through that as well. So sometimes I would have my research hat on, and then I would go into the men's house and I would sit with men, and I would have my notebook and I would, you know, transcribe chants. And then I would also be a woman a lot of the time, and I would just be with my, you know, the women in my house, and I'd be processing manioc and so on. And but then often men would come into the house and tease me and point out that, you know, I wasn't really an NO woman. And so there was a constant gendered play, which was often through, you know, banter and joking about who I was and what my gender identity was in these different kinds of research processes, whether they were more participatory or more kind of, you know, standard interviewing and transcription and that kind of thing. And that's, you know, that process in itself is very interesting. And I do write about that in the book a bit.
Yes, thank you. That's very enlightening. But perhaps just to take the question a little bit more widely, I mean, when you arrived there, did they simply say, it's great to have you? Or was it a bit more complex than that?
Oh, no, it was more complex than that. And the thing is, it never stopped being complex than that. You know, I went through the process of, you know, them saying yes, going through a process that took more than a year of getting permission from the Brazilian state, various different agencies that need to all be brought together to make that happen. It's very difficult as a foreign researcher to work in a demarcated indigenous territory in Brazil. But, you know, the NO, they, you know, there was this kind of dynamic of conflict and negotiation, what I talked about with the state of kind of alternating between you know, pushing back and inviting back in. That was happening with me all the time. So although I had this research authorization, it wasn't really worth anything, and you know, they would literally dangle it over the fire. So it was a very sort of ongoing diplomacy, my own research process, which is something that, you know, I also write about, but I'd love to kind of explore in more depth also later on.
Absolutely. And Olivia, did you have the same sense of gender fluidity? So when you were integrating with the people that you were with, it was just the same as Chloe, or was there a difference there?
Well, it was a lot different because it was much less ritual, but there was also some form of fluidity and equality. So I know that in other Amazonian groups there can be conjugal violence, but that's not something that I ever witnessed in the field. And also there were some play of about gender reversal. I mean, in some cases there were transgender persons, but also some form of playful, let's wear my wife's clothes just to walk around the village, just for fun. Let's wear some bras and see what happens. So there was this kind of fluidity, which was indeed changing because of intensified contacts with Venezuelan and Guyanese non-Indigenous people.
That actually leads us nicely onto the next question. So Robert McDowell, and good afternoon, Robert, would like to think about social coercion. I mean, in such a fluid society, how then could you have social coercion? And so you clearly see that he's asking, for example, how did you make people, or how did they make people take part in the rituals?
Yeah, I only saw a couple of times kind of processes of disciplining happening. I think that it's not something that I've made the focus of my research, and I wouldn't be able to like be super nuanced about it, but it's also okay. Like, you don't have to go out there and dance every day. Like, men take days off, and there's so many people that it's kind of okay and it's kind of understood. But there's a way in which yeah, I don't actually know what happens at the level of kind of, you know, a lazy teenage son and what his dad says to him in the morning to get him out of bed at 3 a.m. That's a kind of level maybe that I didn't access. I did sort of see once my younger sister, so the family that whose sort of room I lived in, the woman I called mother, she had 11 children, 9 of whom were already kind of married, and they were the kind of grown-up women who I did the work with every day, but she had 2 unmarried kids, so they were in the process of kind of betrothal negotiations while I was there. And I do remember my kind of preteen stroppy younger sister not being impressed with who she was supposed to marry, and going into a kind of revolt and the ways that she was ostracized. And literally I remember her standing in the corner of the room just like not moving and not speaking. And I guess, you know, in a way, like I sometimes want to use the word totalitarian. I mean, these are people who live in this panoptic village who all dress the same, and in which there is clearly like a lot of conformity. And so obviously there are forms of disciplining going on within this, but that's really something that I would need to research a lot more closely.
Yeah, so that's obviously fascinating, but can you think of any areas where some kind of social sanction might have been brought into force? So clearly you're saying that people don't choose their spouses, for example, and so there must be compulsion there. And with homosexuality, was that at all an issue? Anything like that?
I don't know anything about homosexuality. It's not something that the NRN admitted to being practiced. So I wouldn't like to say anything about that. Yeah, and then again, it's a kind of level of I guess it's a level of questioning about kind of individual psychology and motivations that I'm not that comfortable with answering kind of on behalf of NRN people. I guess I just prefer to kind of take a pass and stick to what I know and what I can say, and not risk myself.
Of course, yes, of course. And Alberto Jimenez would just like to say here, awesome work, which is of course doesn't need any particular question. But Mitch Sedgwick would like to ask a question now, moving towards the international side. And he says, looking forward, is there interest in your work, and if so, by whom, with regard to international negotiations we can anticipate in the future, such as regarding the COVID-19 crisis or global warming? So this really very interesting question of how these outside protocols are beginning to impact upon the people with whom you are living.
Yeah, so a friend of mine and I, we kind of put together a journal issue on diplomacy, and we were trying to bring our work on Amazonian ritualized diplomacies. And he works on a ritual where it's a kind of mock battle, and so we were kind of thinking about the ways that Amazonian indigenous peoples' rituals kind of simulate violence and kind of bring it to the fore, and kind of do this kind of brinkmanship, walking a line between kind of conciliation and aggression, and the ways that the Western diplomatic kind of forms that we're used to, kind of, you know, the UN round forum with this kind of very symbolic sort of global thing, which is actually quite similar to the NRN, is circular village. So that's one of the things I've thought about, is this sort of circularity and how that circular space enables certain kinds of politics to happen. So that's a similarity, but then a difference is that the kinds of actions and symbolism that a lot of Western ritualism within diplomacy is much more kind of, in a way, like obvious and peace-seeking and less ambivalent and complex. So that's the journal I'm referring to is Terrain, which is a wonderful French bilingual multimedia journal that's all open access online. And that's where we think about some of these questions, especially because international diplomacy now is in such flux with, you know, with digital media and with the kind of decline of multilateral organizations, the decline in their influence and the rise of the influence of kind of big corporations and stuff. There's a lot sort of up in the air. And so it's an interesting time to be thinking about new forms of diplomacy.
Would this be a good point to inform us a little bit about the negotiations which are taking on with regard to the dam? I mean, you described beautifully how they were ongoing. Do the villagers themselves think there's any kind of satisfactory outcome in the settlement they received, and are they carrying on this continuous basis to engage with these outside bodies to see what else they can get? I mean, how are things developing?
Yeah, I don't have a completely up-to-date answer on this, because the last time I was there was 2013, and at that point, basically there was a sort of, I think there's been a kind of routinization of the relationship with the hydropower company. You know, what they did manage to get, which was something that the state basically desperately didn't want to give them, was a permanent indemnity payment. So a monthly payment that the NRN said, you white people, you get salaries every month, like magic, this money just pops up in your account. We want that too. You know, why should we have this one-off payoff? We know we're going to spend it all on motorboats and then it's going to be gone. We won't have any money to buy the gasoline for the motorboats or to maintain the motorboats. So give us a permanent indemnity. And it took a lot of road blocking and a lot of, you know, different actions from the NRN to get that agreement, and so they have that now, and they have two different indigenous associations which receive that money and distribute it and so on. So I think there's been a routinization. There's also been the construction of a road in 2013 which has intensified back and forth with the state, but the road has also become now a massive source of contention, because of course roads aren't just built in the Amazon either. They have to be maintained, and they get flooded and they get boggy. And so now, you know, these road blockades are still kind of very, very frequent, and there's always something to push back on. And so basically the same dynamic continues over new themes.
But was I right to, on that note, was I right to sense an ambiguity or an ambivalence somewhere about the whole modernization project? And I wasn't quite sure whether that came from the author or from the peoples themselves. I mean, you clearly state that one of the reasons they wanted a road was to have access to Western medicine, for example, and they loaded up the van and they took them out. And so, but they're presumably aware of the difficulties and the complications and the downside of the things that will develop as well, if they try to embrace a development in any straightforward way. I mean, is that an active part of their considerations vis-a-vis the external world?
I mean, of course, it's all an experiment with the possibilities and limitations of that relationship constantly. But it's an experiment that they can't but be constantly engaged with. You know, what are they going to do? They're surrounded by soya farms and hydropower dams now. They're not going to burn their motors and build a fence and say, see you in 100 years. So it's just this ongoing project of how to coexist and how to retain some autonomy and sovereignty within a situation of encompassment.
But do they actually talk about it at all, I mean, amongst themselves, about what are we going to do now? I mean, how does that kind of discourse develop within the community, the modernization discourse? How would they themselves conceptualize it?
I don't know how they conceptualize it, but they talk about it all the time. I mean, meetings in the center of the village they're constantly discussing this stuff. Yeah, it's of course.
And so are they able to maintain their rituals with the fish that they buy now, rather than the fish that they used to hunt?
So in fact, I was very interested in this question of whether the Anawana would become fish farmers, because it's something, again, that they experimented with. Well, you know, the white people in town, they've got these fish farms. They breed this transgenic species of fish, which gets fat very, very quickly on purchased feed, which is, you know, no doubt made from the soya farms. So it's super easy. Let's try it. And some men actually dug fish ponds in the village and sort of experimented with it. I don't know how successful that was, but they haven't stopped building fishing dams. So this year, for example, there was at least 2 fishing dams built. So again, we're in a situation of kind of, you know, experimentation, I'd say.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Olivia, I don't know if you want to step in at this point. Is there anything that you find has resonance with your own work that you would like to comment about?
Yeah, I'd like to maybe add something just about this, is that without, I mean, I'm talking about universals, but in Amazonia, in native Amazonia at least, very often it's been easier for indigenous people to adopt outboard motors, roads, trucks, radios, and etc. Tools, rather than change their relations, their kind of relations they have with other entities. And for instance, to start raising animals, farm animals, pigs or cows, or so that's why I'm a bit, I'm very curious about the Anawene's attempt at farm fishing, because it's not just I mean, it's a technology, but it's also a specific kind of relation where you're feeding, protecting, raising, managing the reproduction of animals. And I mean, there are some cases of Amazonians turning into cattle farmers, but that's very exceptional. So I'm very curious about this, and so there are more. It's easier for them very often to imagine industrial development than turning to another kind of food production. And if I may, I also wanted just to go back to your first question, because I didn't really answer properly, but I wanted to add something to stress Chloe's work. That I think it's easier for, I mean, it's harder for men anthropologists to have access to female discourses and practices, even when there is a lot of gender fluidity, rather than for a female anthropologist to study male ritual. So I think female anthropologists often can do a better job at having a global picture rather than men.
Thank you. Do you want to talk about that at all, Chloe, this question?
I think Ollie did such a nice job. We've got quite a bunch of questions.
Yeah, so let's go on to the whole group of them about religion then. As you see, there are several about the Pentecostal Church and any other kind of organized religious activity. I mean, how does that operate within the village, and anything you want to say about it, really?
Yeah, so I see Rachel's question there. I was kind of joking about Protestant ethic of industriousness and Puritanism, and also accumulation of wealth, which is a big thing. You know, Amazonians aren't supposed to be interested in accumulating surplus, but the Anawenê do precisely that. Their economy is all oriented to accumulating a surplus, whether it's drying tons of fish so that you can then circulate it as currency for 3 months after, or accumulating and drying manioc products, which you then use as forms of payment and exchange and so on. So when I've given, you know, obviously a lot of presentations now about my work, and because I don't mention the missionaries much, because they were these, you know, liberation theologists, radical left Catholic Jesuits who didn't want to change anything about the indigenous culture. You know, the Anawenê hadn't heard of Jesus or Christian God when I was there. That's not going to be the case now. then yes, I've been asked so many times, oh, you didn't mention the missionaries, but surely the Protestants must be there, and that must be why they don't drink beer or tobacco. And so it's just kind of something that I've incorporated into the way I speak about them. You know, isn't it kind of interesting that they have this kind of their own Puritan ethic that they developed through a historical process. I have an analysis in the book where I talk about why it might be that when all the people around them, and including the people that they're very closely related to, that they would have been part of the same kind of polity as historically, all ferment manioc beer and have, festivals which are about drinking this fermented manioc beer. And getting energetic and getting happy. Well, why is it that the NONA just deliberately kind of don't ferment their manioc products and instead get happy and energetic through this kind of work, which is one of the things that I sort of think is interesting about the work regimes that I was talking about, the ways that they produce something that's a bit like the drunkenness and the self-alteration that other peoples get through, drinking beer or tobacco, or in other parts of Amazonia, yagir, ayahuasca, all these things that when we think of the Amazon, they come to mind, and that the NONA don't do. So maybe that's been, hopefully that's been a bit illuminating on that.
Yes, but the formal interactions with the church. I mean, you mentioned, for example, that one of the Jesuits was murdered. That was nothing. How did that? I was very curious about that. That perhaps you could talk about that, and it would help us understand the different dynamics a little bit.
Yeah, well, so the Jesuit organization basically turned into an NGO when NGOs became a thing in the 90s. So this organization, which is called Operação Amazônia Nativa, still works with the NONA, although much less than it used to, because since the NONA have had a much more active relationship with the state, they kind of haven't needed OPAL to be their sole kind of link to the outside world, which was the case for so many years. Kiwishi, as he's called by the NONA, or Vicente Canas, he's really a martyr for the Brazilian Catholic left, the pro-indigenous Catholic left in Brazil, which has, done amazing work with indigenous people in Brazil, and was really central to the way that the constitution in Brazil changed in the early 90s to recognize indigenous rights and the right to kind of multicultural citizenship. So these people are real heroes for lots of people in Brazil. And Vicente Canas was murdered by a landowner at the point when they were trying to build a road through the NONA's lands on his way on his own, in the boat from the village to town, slept overnight somewhere. He was assassinated. I don't want to, again, I'm not the person to speak about his life. Books have been written about his life, and the Jesuit organization, does treat him as a martyr. So it is, again, not my place to kind of talk about it extensively, but it is an event that is very significant in the history, particularly for the missionaries. And the NONA remember him very fondly, and they remember these events, of course, as important, but they're sort of part of a bigger story for them, and they're not sort of singled out.
So formal interaction with religious churches is at the moment not very common in the everyday life, or is it?
Well, I've got to be humble about this too. It's been since 2013 that I haven't been in the field, and one of the major changes is that now teenagers do some of their schooling in town. So undoubtedly, they're much more exposed to kinds of churches and things like that. And I don't know if there has been an attempt at catechization or anything like that from any of the churches. I know that in the Upper Xingu, which is, I talked a bit about the Waozhao, and I was talking about the feminist stuff. I know that evangelical churches are entering there now. So it could be, I just don't know.
Well, thank you for that. Before we go into a different topic, do you want to talk at all about formalized religion and the people you work with, Olivier? It's such a fascinating question.
Yeah, maybe just a few words to say that. So the region I studied was in a very, very different situation because of what I had contact with missionaries for a long time. And since the early 20th century, the Venezuelan state had given the Capuchin order a kind of delegation of civil authority over the indigenous population. And more recently, different evangelical churches started working in the area. But what I would say is that it would be, and I think that Chloe has already stressed that point, is that it would be a mistake to see it as a question of religion, because very often missionaries or converts reason much more than that. So in my case, Catholic missionaries were proto-state actors, and in a way it could be said that conversion to Protestantism represents a new form of kinship. And those are topics that Amazonian anthropologists have discussed a lot, and especially the late Pete Gao with his work in Peru.
Well, thank you. And now we move on to Alberto's question, when he talks about, he says, can we hear more about river dams and traps? Is there any sense in which diplomatic relations with the state are analogized as a type of trap too, or different kinds of traps, depending on the moment and occasion?
Hi, Alberto. Alberto and I have co-authored a bunch of, well, some stuff on traps. And one of the tussles that we had when we were writing together is that Alberto is very interested in analogies and concepts, and I'm much more kind of boring and concrete in the ways that I think about traps as technologies. And yeah, no, I don't know. I've not heard the NONA kind of metaphorize traps in that way. I mean, because traps are so humanoid and phallic in the ways that I've described, like because traps basically are you know, a way of thinking about men's bodies and men's own capacities, I think it would be a strange thing for them to use as an analogy for their relationship with the state. That's me thinking off the top of my head about it. But then, of course, okay, I'm going to maybe try and go a bit further. But you know, the fact that they were dam builders and the state was building dams, you know, that was a source of, that was a great source of imagination. I mean, every culture has its flood myths, right? The Bible has its flood myths. So the great flood that wipes out mankind and so on. And the NONA have their flood myth too, in which the kind of the demonic spirits build a dam and all the people are caught in traps and die, except for 2 people who are left on top of a mountain and who then reproduce and make humanity again. And so, you know, there's a lot of, you know, there are these kinds of universal tropes that then get concretized when one society builds a concrete dam above another society's wooden dam, and the ways that that's thought about. And so when the NONA were kind of, you know, I was helping them say, write a statement for a campaigning organization. They would use these kinds of stories to talk about what it meant for them that a dam was being built that would, you know, invalidate their dams. And, you know, in the past, the demons built a dam and we all died, and this is what's going to happen now. So yeah, there were ways in which the kind of mythological imagination was being mobilized and re kind of thought in the current context. Thanks.
So should we understand the situation as one where they have multiple interactions with people from the outside world, all of which have their own agenda, but some of them explicitly try to protect them and help them, and other ones that actually try to take their lands away, and so they get caught up in these wider dynamics? Is that process happening at the moment? or when you were there?
I mean, it's kind of not a simple kind of, it's not such a simple division. Most of the people that the NONA come into contact with are working in their jobs because they want to help Indigenous people. So, and there's a lot of kind of weird hybridization. So a guy who used to work for Opin, the successor to the missionary organization, you know, he had 4 kids. He lived in the area. He needed a job. The hydroelectric dam company came looking for him, offered him a big salary, presumably to work for them and help negotiate the dams. He thought he could negotiate a much better settlement for the NONA if he worked for the dam company, because he spoke their language and he would do a better job. And then, I mean, very difficult for him, of course, and he ended up being, you know, ostracized for a time for taking this salary from the hydropower company. And then you have all the ways that the Brazilian state machinery is complex. And, you know, you've got the biggest soya producer in the country, Blairo Maggi, who also becomes the state governor, and before he's the state governor, he's the minister for the environment in the government, and he also owns the company that's building the hydropower dams. And the hydropower dams energy is being used to fuel the soya agribusiness, and it's all a very kind of oligarchical, tightly woven net of vested interests. But also, Blairo Maggi will get in his helicopter and he will land in the NONA's village, and he will be very civil with NONA people, and, you know, he will engage with them, and that is something obviously that they appreciate. So yeah, it's kind of, there's a way in which we always want to tell a much simpler story, but actually, you know, they are engaging with so many different agencies, and they might be playing the agency for the environment against the agency for Indigenous affairs, and these agencies all have their own beef with each other. So, you know, the whole thing isn't Indigenous state, it's a multiplicity of agencies with their own agendas who are also competing amongst themselves, into which the NONA are doing their strategic politicking. And I think with, you know, since the main time of my fieldwork, that will only have become more complex than it was then.
It's particularly as you suggested that some of them are now going to school. And how did that process happen? Did that happen via the missionaries, or how did the first child go to school from the village?
I don't know about the ways that it's evolved, but it was very interesting. Part of the kind of ethic of incarnation of the missionaries, what they did I think it started in the late 80s, was they started to develop a script for writing in the NONA language. So they didn't try and teach Portuguese. They just did workshops to develop a script in the NONA's language. So young NONA men were literate in NONA Naui before they started doing any schooling in Portuguese. And while I was there was just a very kind of makeshift school, and it was the successor to the missionary organization that would come and, you know, teach a bit of Portuguese. But now I think it's become the state and their kind of educational machinery, and that in Brazil it's not really a kind of bilingual, bicultural kind of education scheme as you do have in some parts of the Amazon, something a bit more developed along those lines. It's pretty kind of standard, I think. But I, again, don't know too much about it at this point without having been there for a few years.
Yeah, of course. The situation changes so quickly, as indeed one of the people said in the chat. Olivia, is there anything you'd like to say about education in the States and the reaction to the villagers to that process?
Well, what I've had some form of some schools in their villages for a long time, but not in all villages. So it creates also some form of internal differentiation. And a bit like Chloe said, but maybe even more pronounced, they interact with a variety of institutional and non-institutional actors, and sometimes from different countries. What I would like to add also, maybe that something that Chloe hasn't said, is that the Enawene, who really look like a block now, are also historically the merging or combination of different people. I mean, there are at least strong evidence on that respect. And so there is also an internal complexity of indigenous people in other places. In Brazil, for instance, well, in some cases, even the Nawene have had to negotiate with other, with the state, but in coordination with other indigenous groups. In the Upper Xingu, there is a strong multi-ethnic polity, and in other places, and including in Venezuela where I work, the ethnic frontier between indigenous and non-indigenous people is very frequently crossed by individuals. So that's also adds some form of complexity, because you can have state functionaries who are indigenous people from your own group or from another ethnic group.
Yeah, and then the question is, what happens to the money? Do they translate it into building Western-like houses in the local towns, or what? How does the introduction of a Western economy work in these circumstances? I suppose that's a question to both of you. It's obviously a very, very interesting one.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something there to what Oli was saying. So the sort of hybridized situation of a much more kind of complex ethnic scene that you get in lots of parts of the Amazon. One of the things that's kind of weird about Mato Grosso is that it is kind of indigenous people, and then kind of German and Italian origin, generally Brazilians from the very south of the country, who migrated up in the 60s, founding these new frontier towns and being given lots to farm by the government. So in a way, it's a much starker interethnic divide in Mato Grosso than it is at almost anywhere else in the Amazon or in Brazil and beyond. So that also, now with Mato Grosso is overwhelmingly supportive of Bolsonaro, and so it's a very kind of patriarchal, white supremacist, colonial frontier society, for the very majority of which indigenous people, having 14% of Brazilian territory, within being demarcated as indigenous territory is too much, and who celebrate, the expansion of soya agribusiness and the way that it's contributing to Brazilian GDP. So there's a way in which Mato Grosso is a very stark and simple frontier, a kind of Wild West story, let's say, from US history or something like that, which is not at all representative of the Amazon basin in general.
Yes, I don't know. I mean, did you want to reply to that one, Olivier, or was that you? That's fine. Well, in that case, there's a question from a student, an undergraduate, and who says that they're just beginning, but is it reasonable that they should he could make an analogy with sport in the village and sport and the dancing that people are doing in the village?
Yeah, I wonder. I know there's some really great kind of ritual theory where the discussion between what is ritual and what is game is discussed. I'm trying to think of the reference, but it's a really interesting division. What is it that makes that analytical divide between something like ritual and something like sport? So I can don't want to be too theoretical, but I didn't mention, although I do talk about it a bit in the book, the Enawene have their own sport ball game called Haida, which is a game where you basically use the central arena of the village, which is a circle, as the pitch. You draw a line in the sand across the middle. You've got this rubber ball, and it's struck with the head not the feet, so it's a football, but only heading. It's very, very kind of crazy and intense, because in order to strike the ball with your head, you have to basically dive onto the floor chest first, and then throw your head back like this to get the ball to go up in the air. And so men, this is a kind of arena for, obviously there's some men who are really great at Haida and some men who are a bit crap at it, just like with football. And so part of the ritual routine in one of the sequences, the sequence up to going to the dam, is playing Haida every morning. And it's something that I would like to kind of research more intensively, because I couldn't get a sense of, like, it's not like teams. It's not like there's the same team every day, and it's not like clans are divided into teams or hosts and guests. Like, it's another division altogether. Again, I think it's about mixture and so on. And then there's a whole like commerce that goes on of kind of betting on this game and taking, people bring out goods and leave them by their houses, things like fish hooks, soap, but even like really valuable things like radios, and someone who's struck well. But again, I didn't really get the rules of the game. As many times as I tried to ask and figure out, people come and take goods from opponents and so on. So yeah, sport, games, ritual, dance, where are the divisions? And people are obviously playing on those distinctions.
Well, there we are. I hope that's inspired you to go off and look at these things further. But on your theoretical inspirations, I think it was wonderful the way you integrated them with your account. I mean, you make reference to Gluckman, for example. I mean, as well as, of course, to Levi-Strauss, but was Gluckman a real inspiration for your work, or was it just something you slipped in, or how did you encounter him?
I haven't read loads of Gluckman, to be honest. I mean, I know that I should, there are many things, but I think that what Gluckman was trying to get at, the ritual is political, and that ritual is something that is inherently open to transformation through historical change, is also what I'm getting at. And I'm sure I could learn a lot from his work, which is from, an earlier period and from Africa. I just wanted to say to that student, who said, this might be a naive question. I always find that the naive questions are the most interesting ones. I remember being asked in a seminar I gave by a very timid student who almost didn't want to speak, why is the village round? And this was about 5 years ago. And I just wanted to crawl and hide under the desk, because it's such a great question. It's a question I should have been able to answer, and it's something that I couldn't answer. And so then I went away and I thought about it and I wrote about it, and I figured out for myself why it was so important that the village was round. So never be afraid to ask those naive questions, basically.
Oh, and we have a further question from Joanna Lee. She said she has a question which she apologizes may not be highly related, but she's curious as to how they perceive time, as they would have dance and rituals often, like twice a day. But how do they, presumably, how do they know the regularity with which these supposedly were taking place?
Yeah, that's really central, and it's all about sequencing. And so my mum in the village, for example, she would be concerned with like planning the manioc harvests for what was coming. So she'd be saying, okay, so tomorrow it's this song day, next day is this song day, that day we're gonna need to get manioc for this clan. And so people would constantly be planning out sequences of days according to the kind of archetypal sequence of the ritual in song days within that sequence. And then people knew that there was a shift ahead, either to the next stage in the ritual. Okay, then the fisherman would leave for the dams, or then the fisherman would return to the dams, or within the return for the dams, we'd have finished our EHESSS clan and we'd be on to Towainide Kasi clan. Or we'd be finished with the entire sequence and it would be time to plant the manioc gardens for the first clan and then the second clan. And each of these stages has its kind of archetypal sequence of song days. And so people are constantly kind of counting out time through the ritual calendar in this way. And then like the final kind of horizon is, okay, the end of Yankwa, and then it will be Lerohi. And then, it's kind of like the configuration of people's everyday routine changes with these different seasons and seasons within seasons. And so what I was talking about, the kind of the way that work sort of drives life forward, is there's a kind of sense that you're always looking forward to the next thing, and you're always kind of projecting the way that your life will be transformed by the arrangements of the new season and the new kind of economy that would imply, because at Leruki you're going to harvest your corn and you're going to drink corn drinks, which are delicious, and you're bored of manioc now because you've been drinking it for 8 months. So yeah, there's a lot more to be said about time and to be explored in that temporality, but it's definitely something that that I include in my account of the way that activity is sequenced and the way that people are constantly talking about this sequencing.
Yes, but during the sequence during the day, though, how do they know when they should start the ritual and finish the ritual during the day? Because you say that it happens twice a day at fairly regular intervals.
Yeah, well, as I say, people have clocks, but also, they're very adept at reading the stars, and so, there might be there's a session of night-long flute play which ends when the morning star rises above the houses, and so people look for the morning star. So that's something that some anthropologists have written whole ethnographies about. Astronomical knowledge. I always get the two mixed up, and it's something that I really, I could barely understand for myself the phases of the moon. So how was I gonna get it knowledge on these things? It was beyond me, like so many things, like plant knowledge and knowledge of fauna and so on. But there is all of that knowledge.
Well, we're almost out of time, but just to finish, would you say that Lévi-Strauss was your greatest inspiration when you were writing it? You do mention him a lot, or was it somebody else? Or was it nobody? Was it just yourself?
Just say that I think that Chloe has the best knowledge of Lévi-Strauss in the UK, certainly today, and maybe in Europe.
That's hilarious. Basically, I went to, after I did my undergraduate, I went to Brazil to learn anthropology in Rio, and I took courses especially with Eduardo Veras de Castro, who's one of the kind of main, most exciting readers of Lévi-Strauss. And he did a whole 16-week course on Lévi-Strauss's Mythologique, in which we would sit together for 4 hours every week, having previously, through the week in teams, read chunks of it and come up with our own analysis. The Mythologique is 4 tomes, each of 300 pages, that just wades through myth after myth after myth after myth. So to me, it was kind of completely balmy and amazing that in the Brazilian pedagogic system, you were able to do this kind of deep reading, and that there were 25 students who desperately wanted to take this course. And it was great fun. And so actually I learned to read Lévi-Strauss in Brazil, as well as with my supervisor, Stephen Hugh Jones. And yeah, I think for me, I guess the thing about Lévi-Strauss is a couple of things. One, he worked next door to me. He worked with the Nambiquara, who are the Enauenese neighbors. They're also part of Enauene identity in a way, some of the Enauene come from Nambiquara ancestry kind of thing. And he worked with the Bororo, who are a very similar kind of dialectical central Brazilian village. So there's a lot of kind of just ethnographic inspiration from there. And then for me, Lévi-Strauss asks the big questions. He asks the questions like, why are the villages round? Why are villages all over the world round? What do villages in Polynesia that are round have in common with villages in Brazil that are round? So he asks these questions, but he can't always answer them because he didn't actually do that much field research. So the questions remain for us to take up and answer in our own ways, which is why it's kind of fun to think with him as an opening rather than, as an endpoint.
Well, we are now out of time, but that's a marvelous conclusion to our talk. So everybody can go off and not only read Chloe's book, but also revisit their copies of Lévi-Strauss dusting on the shelves. Anyway, so we have to thank Olivier Allard for joining us, and for Chloe for being with us as well, and for writing the book, and the audience for your wonderful questions. And we hope to see you again at another RAI event soon. So thank you very much indeed.